Have villagers in Dorset been worshipping in their parish churches, unaware that they create magical patterns in the landscape that were designed to invoke the gods and goddesses of Christianity, much as if they were pagan deities? This would have been viewed by the Church of Rome as a pagan perversion of Christianity, the work of the devil, and would have been condemned as heresy. That is the question raised by Jonathan Harwood, a graduate in social anthropology who spent his professional career in the land registry. He has devoted countless hours to recovering and decoding these patterns and researching their historical context. He was originally inspired by Henry Lincoln, whose discoveries concerning the enigmatic village of Rennes-le-Château in the south of France inspired the plot of Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, with its tale of the secret marriage of Jesus to Mary Magdalene. Lincoln believes that the positions of churches in the landscape around Rennes-le-Château mark the ancient pattern of a vast and invisible temple, and he proposed that the specific distance of a little less than 3 miles was the key measure used in the design of this temple. Out of no more than idle curiosity, Jonathan began looking for this key measure in the distances between churches in South Dorset, and so began many years of study and research.
I'm standing on the ramparts of the great Iron Age hill fort of Maiden Castle. This was the tribal capital of the Celtic Durotriges, and I can imagine a meeting taking place here at about the time of the birth of Christ, perhaps in 7 BC, when a rare conjunction took place of Saturn and Jupiter in the constellation of Pisces that might well have been the decisive event in opening the age of Pisces. The tribal rulers might have wanted to know from their Druid advisors why this once prosperous land was sick and the people and livestock were starving. The priests might have advised that the great wheel of time had turned and the constellation of Aries the ram no longer rose behind the sun at the spring equinox. This augured a time of turmoil, when the powers of the old gods had waned and the predicted new god of the age of Pisces had yet to reveal himself. The old patterns binding the land to the old gods had to be renewed, but not yet. Nothing could be done immediately. And within 50 years, the Roman legions swept away the old heroic culture of the Durotrigan warriors right here on these ramparts, and the Druids were also hunted down and destroyed. The survivors were driven underground, but the need to renew the great patterns binding the land was not forgotten. These patterns had their origins far in the past and may once have been marked by standing stones. This stone is called the Hell Stone, and it hints at the great antiquity of these patterns. It stands here now rather incongruously in the middle of this field, but it would have required an enormous amount of communal effort to drag it here and erect it more than 4,000 years ago, and so it must have been very important. It interests me because it is equidistant from 2 churches which themselves probably stand on far older sacred sites, and the distance from the churches to this stone is Henry Lincoln's key measure. And so the sites of churches may well preserve these very ancient patterns. This little parish church at Broadmain, for example, is also equidistant from 2 churches in the villages of Binkham and Stinsford. And again, the distance is Henry Lincoln's key measure. This triangle of churches, however, links very directly to his discoveries, because central to these discoveries are the sacred figures of the pentagon and the hexagram. If the key measure sides of this triangle are taken to be the length of the sides of a pentagon in a circle, then the baseline is the length of the sides of a hexagram drawn within the same circle. That could, of course, be coincidence, but it's certainly an odd coincidence. And to explore another of these ancient patterns, we need to return to Maiden Castle. Well, I've come back to Maiden Castle, and behind me are the ruins of a Roman temple, which actually stands on the foundations of a much older circular Celtic temple. It is at the apex of a triangle whose other points are the churches at Stinsford again and Bradford Peveril. Now, this triangle is a pair of right-angled triangles whose sides measure 3 units, 4 units and 5 units. It covers what is now Dorchester, but what was in the Bronze Age an important ritual landscape. These triangles are called Pythagorean triangles, and it's a curious fact that many stone circles dating from the same period as the Hellstone are really complex ellipses based on these very same Pythagorean triangles. And so the same geometry was used in the design of the stone circles and in the great landscape patterns. These triangles must have been sacred to the gods.
What Jonathan is doing, of course, is making inferences from patterns created by drawing lines on a map. The question arises, are these patterns really no more than the result of chance? Here are 25 random points on a sheet of paper representing church symbols, and here are all the lines that can be drawn between them. He is only selecting a few lines and ignoring many others. How does he answer this objection?
So could these patterns really be no more than the random effects of chance and coincidence? Well, I've obviously given a lot of thought to that over the years, and it is true that I'm not putting forward a scientific hypothesis, in the sense that I'm not making blind predictions that can then be independently tested. The fact that I've used Henry Lincoln's key measure does substantially improve the odds that these patterns are not the result of chance. In the end, however, I think it comes down to a matter of judgment. So see what you think. I want to show you a cosmological symbol in the form of a grid that has been aligned to the cardinal points. It has been carefully marked in the landscape by the positions of churches, and its dimensions are based on Henry Lincoln's key measure. I've come to the little parish church of St. Michael and All Angels, Winterbourne Steepleton, and behind me is a sculpture that dates from the Dark Ages that might well depict St. Michael himself, or possibly even his vanquished foe Lucifer. The church dedication is likely to be, therefore, at least as old as this carving. Now, this church is one of the points of a right-angled triangle that bisects the north-south axis of the grid at right angles in such a way as to divide the sides of the grid into units of 3, 6, and 7. Now, I think common sense would suggest that this is not likely to be the result of chance. But what does this grid mean? Well, it is the ancient cosmological symbol of a net, representing the woven web of nature and the vivifying power of harmony which informs the pattern of creation. In Christian terms, it is the Gnostic symbol of the net of salvation, in which the 153 fishes, referred to in St. John's Gospel, represent the saved. This story, where the disciples are instructed by Jesus to cast their net on the other side of the boat, resulting in a catch of 153 heavy fishes, is told within the grid in the ancient numerical language of gematria, in which numbers signify words and phrases. And gematria also attaches another meaning to the number 153, which takes us right back to Rennes le Chateau and the Da Vinci Code. For it is the number of Mary Magdalene, and it is paired with the number 185, the Master, a title given to Jesus in the Gospels. Their sacred union is celebrated in the predominant number 338, which is 153 plus 185.
The purpose of this sacred marriage is described by Margaret Starbird in her book, The Magdalene's Secret Legacy. She writes, The blessings derived from the sacred marriage spread out from the bridal chamber to the land, bringing fertility and well-being to the people and their crops and herds. And so here we have a reason for this great landscape pattern. There is much more than this, because the grid is not only God's great net of salvation, but also, remarkably, an exact scale model at 800 to 1 of the floor plan of the biblical Holy of Holies of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. This was built by King Solomon in the 10th century BC to house the Ark of the Covenant, and was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar II in 587 BC. It is thought to have been situated on the Temple Mount where the Dome of the Rock now stands. The guru of the Earth Mysteries movement, John B. Shell, has written that the restoration of the temple was the dream that inspired the early Christian Gnostics, the Hermetic societies, the Knights Templar and the Order of St. John, the medieval evangelists and magicians, and it was the first aim of the Freemasons. The Christians adhering to the Gnostic heresy of Valentinus, the Holy of Holies was the bridal chamber of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, who represented the Saviour and his consort, the goddess Sophia. It was their sacred marriage, rather than the crucifixion and resurrection, that freed the divine sparks trapped within the bodies and souls of initiated Christians to rejoin their angelic partners within the Gnostic version of heaven. And recently, evidence has come to light that the villa-owning elite in Dorset during the late Roman period, who would have been in a position to commission landscape patterns, were indeed Gnostic Christians who might well have practiced the sacrament of the bridal chamber.
But is there any evidence of early Christians in Dorchester during the Roman period who might have been responsible for this rich and multi-layered symbol? This rather unpromising-looking location is the Marabout trading estate on the edge of Dorchester. And behind me here is a sandstone coffin from the Roman Christian cemetery. The body would have been packed in gypsum to preserve it for resurrection on the Day of Judgment. And the cemetery was right here beneath these industrial units. The archaeologist reached the conclusion that there had been a rapid conversion of the people of Dorchester to Christianity between about AD 315 and 325. He could find no precedent for the extent to which the bodies, in neat east-facing rows, had been crammed together, often only inches apart. I think that in about 315 AD, a group of priests with a Druidic background arrived in Dorchester with a mission to save souls and renew the great patterns that had been woven into the landscape, but recast in terms of the new religion of the age of Pisces, the fish. I think the 4,000 bodies in the graveyard were laid out symbolically as fishes in the net, awaiting the promised salvation on the Day of Judgment. After all, members of early Christian communities were called pisciculi, or little fishes. And so, looking out over towards Dorchester, I can see, at least in my mind's eye, the great net that is spread over the landscape. This is a symbol steeped in knowledge that was reserved for the initiated, and so had to be hidden from plain sight. It was the renewal of an ancient pagan tradition that the Roman Church would have regarded as the work of the devil. This was heresy, and what a perfect irony it is that it was the Church of Rome that unwittingly preserved this heresy through the many centuries that have passed since the death of the last of these early, and perhaps in some ways more enlightened, Druidic Christians.
This brief outline of Jonathan's highly detailed work raises some fascinating questions, and, if it is not all just a result of chance and coincidence, throws surprising and unexpected new light on a very dark period of history. Only some of the many patterns discovered by Jonathan have been explored in this film, but his work raises a larger question. He has confined his attention to a very small area around Dorchester and has found a way, never attempted before, to analyse these patterns so that their meanings can be interpreted. Using his methods, how much more awaits discovery in both Dorset and perhaps across the whole country?